When we think of the season of Lent, we invariably think of a period of 40 days. And that follows upon a grand tradition that we see going all the way back in the scriptures of various periods of 40, be it 40 days or 40 years. And perhaps the most important of these is the journey of the people of Israel in the desert, that 40-year sojourn in the desert between the Exodus and the taking of the promised land. And what happens in the desert? Well, when the people of Israel were freed from Egypt after the great miracle of the Red Sea, they enter into the desert where God forms them as a people. And when they enter the desert, they are basically a group of runaway slaves. But at the end of that 40-year period, they come out of the desert and emerge from the desert a nation with a set of laws, a cult of worship, and a covenant relationship with Almighty God. So God spends that time with the people of Israel in the desert, forming them to be the people He needed them to be to conquer the land He had promised to Abraham. This journey would be referenced to by the prophet Hosea in dealing with his unfaithful wife, a relationship that became a metaphor with God's relationship with His unfaithful people. And the final resolution of that with God is Him saying to His people, I will lure you into the desert and speak tenderly to your heart. And that is hearkening back to the experience in the desert of God's people that the prophets are now reminding them of as a means whereby God will help bring the people back to Him because they had fallen away. We see it again with a period of 40 days with the prophet Elijah, after the great showdown on Mount Carmel, in which he overcomes the 400 prophets of Baal. He flees the wrath of Queen Jezebel, and he goes into the desert for 40 days on a journey to Mount Oreb, the mountain of the Lord, on the Sinai Peninsula. And during that time, he struggles in the desert. He wants to die, but God touches him and gives him the sustenance he needs and says, continue on the journey. And he continues on that journey to God's holy mountain, where after, of course, the wind, the fire, and the earthquake, he has that encounter with God and that still, small voice speaking inside him and commissioning him, renewing him in his call as a prophet to the people. We see it again in the New Testament with Jesus Himself, who goes into the desert. And what does He experience in that 40 days in the desert following the baptism and before He begins His ministry of preaching? He experiences intense temptation. He goes to the desert to face the tempter. And that becomes a period of transition and preparation for him after baptism before he begins his time of preaching, and he faces down that temptation. We too recreate that in this season of Lent, in which we are called to create a desert of sorts in the sacrifices and penances we engage in. Which is why I always encourage people, when you give something up for Lent, give something up that is truly substantial, truly meaningful, that might be a particular challenge for you to give up, in which we turn to God for that strength to endure. Because the season of Lent is nothing less than a proverbial desert for us, a desert experience in which we open ourselves up to being formed by God through the practices of prayer, almsgiving, and fasting, in ways that will be a challenge, in ways that will invite temptation, as it did in the experience of Jesus. And we go through this season of Lent as God calls us into the proverbial desert to speak tenderly to our hearts, to form us, to discipline us, to give us that strength and that grace to endure in these practices we have committed to during this season, so that we can, in fact, emerge from this desert experience formed by God, different people than we were when we first entered on Ash Wednesday. And each year, let us not make this just another Lent, but a time in which we truly grow in our faith, in our stamina, in our spiritual connection with God and with one another as church, so that it can truly be a fruitful time we spend in this season of Lent, this 40-day sojourn in the proverbial desert, where God lures us to Him, speaks tenderly to our hearts, and with our cooperation and our commitment, forms us to be the people, individually and as a church, He has called us to be.